All right, everyone, if we look at national polling right now, or swing state polling for that matter, we see it flashing red entirely for Trump. This is, I think, it's been a while since he led in national polling, like against Biden, obviously, towards the end when Biden was really cratering and it was clear he wasn't even going to be the nominee. He was leading for a while. Kamala comes in. He maintains a lead for a few weeks, and then she spikes, and now she's receding again. Again, the Kasich effect is wearing off at exactly the right time. We've got about a week to go until the election. This is the end game. You just had Madison Square with Trump. He's ending on an energetic high note, and she's sort of petered into the recesses, sort of petered into the background a little bit. I think her aides warned her, "Miss Harris, it's not a good idea for you to be out in public right now. As much as possible, only do teleprompted rallies, stay on script please, and otherwise ignore the legacy media and all these others, even though they're softballing you because quite clearly you're not up to par." If you look, link in the description, not archive, this is a rolling average from RCP, Trump has now taken a very small lead in national polling. This is contraposed to 2016 when he was behind about 4 or 5 points at this point, and 2020 when he was behind about 8 points, actually, in national polling. Now, here's an interesting scenario to think of. We can expect up to 3 points of poll movement between the final results in national polling and swing state polling and what the result is. If it moves in the same direction, best case scenario for Trump, it moves in the same direction 2 or 3 points that it did in 2016 and 2020. So it moves in his favor. This puts him over the edge in national polling, gives him a +2, +2.5. It gives him all of the swing states, and it brings Virginia and New Hampshire and Minnesota potentially into competition. While it's more likely than not Kamala still wins all 3 of them, it would be by a very underwhelming margin. It wouldn't be like 2020 numbers. It'd be less than 2016 numbers. Virginia is probably the one that's most in play, which is why Trump stopped by there the other day, actually. I think that he should hit Virginia with like a triple header, and then he should fly off to the Rust Belt, basically, more than anything else. Go to the East Valley in Arizona, then go back up, spend the rest of your time in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan especially. So that's the best case scenario for Trump. He absolutely crushes it, probably wins the popular vote in the process, and manages to grab up all of the swing states from 2016, possibly one of the blue wall states, maybe all 3. We need more polling. I wish we had better Minnesota, New Hampshire polling, and more from Virginia as well. At this point, then you've got the best case scenario for Kamala, the worst case scenario for Trump. Let's say that you get 2 or 3 points of movement away from Trump. This still puts him at a little bit better than the margin he had in 2016. It would definitely be a lot closer. He wouldn't necessarily be favored to win all of the swing states. But that worst case scenario for Trump, based on likely poll movement, assuming some last-minute shift, still gives him the opportunity to win. He would still have a measurable chance of winning the election, with the worst-case scenario assuming polling remains stable and we see that little bit of wiggle room in one direction or the other. That is, you could see a situation where the polls have overestimated Trump's support, and he still ends up winning. He wouldn't win the popular vote at that point, but he could still win enough of the swing states to be reelected. It would just be closer. I would say Michigan at that point would be, he probably wouldn't get Michigan, but he would probably get Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, possibly Wisconsin. There's the election, by the way, because I don't think North Carolina is particularly in play. I think that that's a phantom, a ghost more than anything else. Georgia would be the big one he could lose a lot of points in such a scenario. But it's more likely, based on data from the last few elections and the dynamics of the race, that it favors Trump in the end. Probably not by even 2 points. I would say probably a point shift or thereabouts. I think the polling is actually a little bit more accurate this time around than we've seen in the rather chaotic election of 2016, certainly, and in 2020 all hell broke loose because of lockdowns and stuff, so it was a little bit more difficult to gauge what was going to happen. Here we've got a little bit more stability altogether, and things have regressed to the same 5 or 6 basic major issues for the most part, so I would expect the shift to be less. But it's more like as not going to favor Donald Trump in the end. Again, by maybe a point and a half or so. This probably gets him all of the competitive swing states, and if you look at early voting returns, both in person and mail-in, that's looking very, very good for the Trump campaign as well, and to some extent, down-ballot Republicans, especially in the Senate. If nothing else changes, I believe that Trump will win re-election. The Republicans will recapture the Senate. They'll break even about in the House. That is, they might lose the House by a few seats or gain a couple of seats. There's not going to be a huge change there, I think. Of course, my preference would be 3 or 4 MAGA candidates get in there. Yeah, buffs up your margin a little bit. MAGA-izes the House Republicans a little bit more. Things then, they get a little bit better, potentially. And maybe you have a sane House leadership for the first time in many years, by the way. Because Pelosi's not sane, McCarthy wasn't sane. Johnson does a little bit better, but, you know, he's more of a procedural, like a McConnell sort of Republican than anything else. Sort of playing the game. McConnell and Lindsey Graham love to do this as well, you see. So that would be my expectation. We've still got a week. What we need is the final round of polling. We'll get that in a few days, and that'll basically cap it off. At that point, I'll be able to make my final prediction state by state for the competitive states, roughly the electoral count that I expect and so forth. But if nothing else changes, I would expect Trump to win. He's still performing about 5 points better right now in national polling than he was in 2016 when he won. He's outperforming in several of the swing states, although it's close in most of them. But you got to realize back then he was behind in most of those states. I think it was in 5 of those 6 states he was actually a bit behind. He simply at the 11th hour he gained more support in the end. I have a feeling that that'll happen this time around. I'm just seeing a huge enthusiasm gap opening up. I'm seeing very, very enthused core fans of Trump, and I'm seeing a relatively smaller, lackluster enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. Her coalition overall appears to be slightly larger, but the enthusiasm level is far lower. Who's more likely to drag themselves to the polls, especially if it's inclement weather? Somebody who really, really has an axe to grind with the other guy and or really, really loves their guy, or somebody who's like, well, yeah, tacitly I support this candidate. And the other one's a bit worse, or maybe this one's a bit better, but I'm not really enthusiastic. It's going to come down to the enthusiasm gap in the end as well. If early voting is any indicator, I have a feeling that the enthusiasm's with the Trump campaign. I think this is pretty obvious, actually, at this point. So that would be my read, you know, basically a week out from the election. Again, on the 3rd and 4th, we'll get the final slew of polls before people go to the polls, and hopefully then we'll have a much bigger scatter shot for these different states for the national polling. But the momentum appears to be generally in Trump's direction. In a 50-50 election, I think that he's got a 90% chance of winning. That's about all. Peace out.